Hello and good evening and welcome to another episode of Hayes Reviews. This is Nick broadcasting. I'm the creator of Hayes Reviews, and tonight we are continuing with our live reading of the story of the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, I tried something a little different there with the intro. I hope there was some guitar music and a nice little countdown so that we're not hanging around in limbo watching animations on the screen wondering if anything's supposed to be happening. I thought I would make that a little smoother. So if that came through properly, please let me know. It looks like we've got a few people in the chat. We've got Peter, Elizabeth, Frank, Heidi, and Gwen. Welcome. It's really nice to have you all back here again. We've got another good show tonight, and I actually have prepared a little bit of a preamble ramble. I'm going to call them preamble rambles now, with a few different things to just go over and have a look at to give some wider context to connect what's going on in the present day back to this book that we're going to be reading, which is from 1953. We got Adamski as well. Good evening, sir. SJ as well. Hello. You're heading out. I hope you have a good evening or day wherever you're going, and catch up on the replay, definitely. It's always going to be here on my YouTube. It's in the playlist, so catch up when you can. That'll be good. So yeah, we're gonna do a little preamble ramble. Got a few web pages to show you, and one very interesting one, which was shared within the Telegram group just a couple of days ago. And I think that one is pretty important because it's something we can do, something to get involved with. You know, sometimes when we're analyzing these events and we're looking at these kind of unfolding of schemes and plans to enslave and control, it can be very disheartening. It can be very sad and upsetting and depressing. Particularly many people who start waking up to these agendas can start to feel quite lonely sometimes. They might feel like the black sheep, wondering, why doesn't anyone else see this? Why am I the only one seeing this? Well, you're not alone, and that's partly what I'm trying to do on this channel. But the other thing is, I don't want this channel to be doom and gloom and isn't it terrible, all these horrible things that are happening. No, I want to put some optimism in there, and I want to focus on things that can be done. And quite often we have to rein our attention in to the things that we can control, our spheres of influence in our own lives, in our interactions with other people around us, the way we spend our time, the things that we put our energy and attention and focus on. We do have some control. Yes, there are these big agendas, and they go back hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they're mind-boggling to wrap our heads around. And there's probably it's kind of like trying to change the direction of a glacier, isn't it? It can feel that way. But there are things we can do. There are areas where we can push back, where we can sidestep as the herd is sort of corralled off the cliff. We can kind of maneuver ourselves into a position where we are a little safer, a little more insulated. And so it's part of what I do want to do here. And so I'm always up for anybody who has solutions or things to point out, such as one recent one that I talked about was the Sam Melia case, where this gentleman was arrested, I think 2-year prison sentence for making stickers. And even during the court, during the proceedings, they admitted the stickers were lawful and that they were factually true. And yet he still got a 2-year sentence because of his intention, because of the intention he had behind those stickers. And so, yes, this is the slippery sort of strange times we're heading into. The UK government just redefined their definition of extremism. And if you hadn't heard about that, it's worth looking into and reading up on, because it's quite general, broad, vague, and you can tell and you can sort of see and predict the ways in which it's going to be used against people for saying certain things. One of the things it does say in there, which I think we can hang on to, is that nobody can be, I'm paraphrasing here, but it says words to the effect that anyone can hold any belief, and that is absolutely fine. So I think we need to remember that. That was my phone going off there, excuse me. I think what we need to do is remember that holding a belief is okay, and we state our own beliefs, and we have to be very explicit that we're not intending to people to be violent or anything bad to happen. We have to be very explicit about our intentions, but we can still state our beliefs. But anyway, that's kind of a side tangent to what I want to talk to you about tonight. So that's a little bit of a ramble. We'll get into the preamble ramble now, but it sounds like I'm coming through loud and clear. Sounds like people are hearing me. Peter, good evening. You've been putting out there the term power cowards. Yeah, this is if you missed this is the term that I came up with, or I came up with in collaboration with a friend. We were talking about, we don't want to say elite. We don't want to say controllers, you know. We don't want to say give them these terms which place us, you know. If we say they're the elite, then what are we? We're the servants, the slaves, we're the lower class. So we got to be very careful about the words we use. And I thought power cowards was a good way, because yes, they have power, they've got influence and wealth and power, but they are cowards because the way they operate in the world is misdirection and lies and deceit and cunning and guile, and it's Machiavellian tactics, confusing people and misdirect, and just being, you know, just general wankers. So I think power cowards encapsulates that nicely and lets them know that they're the cowards, not us. We're the ones trying to hold the line, trying to learn, trying to understand and educate and, you know, be there for each other. We're trying to hold strong. And I'll crack on with my intro, because I've got a story that kind of gives you an opportunity to see that in action and also be part of it. So let's carry on with the preamble here. So the first thing is the World Health Organization. I'm sure we all are aware of this august institution, but how does it connect to what we're talking about tonight? Well, if you've seen the first 3 parts of this series, you'll know that the Rockefeller Foundation was set up by John D. Rockefeller Sr., and he bequeathed an enormous amount of dollar to basically the creation of institutions and an organization that would control the way health is managed throughout the world. So that was his intention, and that was kind of what we're seeing unfold as the Rockefeller Foundation is kind of set up, and then it goes out on its first forays into the management of public health. It deals with hookworm, I think, was the first sort of major success. And so it's very closely linked, because now in the present day, 2024, we have the World Health Organization. And 2024, of course, we're 4 years into the great scam of 2020, the big C event. The World Health Organization was front and center of the rollout of that event. So it's worth learning a little about it. So World Health Organization is responsible for international public health. And I'm sure we all remember electing them and voting for them, right? They have decided that they will set the international health standards. And so again, it's this global view of things, or this world view of things, or the realm, whatever you want to refer to this place where we are. They're trying to get all of it under their purview and control. So we've got the Director General is this gentleman, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus of Ethiopia. More on him in a minute. But if you don't know about him, worth looking into his past, where he's from, and the controversies surrounding him. But we'll have a little look at that in a moment. We'll just carry on for now. So a little bit from the history. When the League of Nations was formed in 1920, it established the World Health Organization of the League of Nations. It established the Health Organization of the League of Nations. After World War II, the United Nations absorbed all the other health organizations to form the WHO. So League of Nations was the forerunner to the United Nations, and this was largely influenced and driven by the likes of Cecil Rhodes, Lord Milner, and their round table, and the money left behind by Cecil Rhodes, which was specifically to be used under the care of Lord Rothschild to the development, the creation of a secret society that would expand the British Empire and into a whole world affair. And then through these groups and their influence came the League of Nations, which was version 1. Then there was the United Nations, which is version 2. So very closely linked to this is the WHO, and as we'll see, the Rockefeller Foundation. So the operational history says, in 1947, the WHO established an epidemiological information service via telex. So I've been thinking a lot about this word epidemiological, and we've got a little bit more about that coming up as well, because that's very important and very central to understanding why this whole system may not be the best, may not actually be leading to health and wellness and vitality and prosperity for the most amount of people, even though that's what it says they're doing. So the policies and objectives we've got, as of 2012, the WHO has defined its role as follows: shaping the research agenda, setting norms and standards, catalyzing change. So shaping the research agenda is incredibly important, because if you shape the research agenda, then you've got a decent amount of control over what gets researched. Now, of course, you want to research the things that you can patent, the things that you can make money from by selling them, by creating a customer base and making people need to use them. That's very important. And so shaping the research agenda, that stood out to me. I thought it was worth pointing out. But setting the norms and standards. I mean, this is so arrogant. We're gonna be responsible for the health of the world, and we're going to set the research agenda. We're going to set the norms and standards, and we're going to catalyze change. So what is the change that they're talking about? That would be good to know, wouldn't it? And of course, they got to get something in there about sustainability, the hot topic, hot word these days. So the Wikipedia article has a lot of information on it, as you can see. And it's not, I haven't read this in total detail, but it is worth knowing. There's a good section here about the connection with China, which might become relevant to us as we move forward with this book. But yeah, the current Director General, this gentleman, Dr. Tedros, he's worth knowing about, right? So if we flick forward a tab, a couple of tabs, if you look into this guy, what you'll find is that he has a kind of patchy history, let's say. And I found the change.org petition, which has just over 60,000 signatures. And it says, remove Tedros, the head of WHO, member of TPLF, guilty of crimes against humanity. So quite intriguing there, isn't it? And this is December 2021. So what it says is, this Dr. Ghebreyesus is an active and current member of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. So that's the TPLF there. Tigray People's Liberation Front has ransacked thousands of hospitals, which has exacerbated the condition of healthcare in Ethiopia, increased the number of internally displaced people within Ethiopia, and put millions of individuals at risk of death and disease due to the lack of proper care centers and access to medicine and medical equipment. Human Rights Watch and many other national and international organizations have widely criticized TPLF, EPRDF-led government for crimes against humanity and atrocities toward the Ethiopian people. So, do you think this is a good guy to be putting in charge of the old health of the world? I would submit probably not. And so a little bit further down, going back to the WHO, we've got a little bit about the past. It says, as of 2002, a total of 473 non-governmental organizations had some form of partnership with WHO. So these are non-governmental organizations. What's that? Well, it could be a charity, it could be some sort of foundation, some sort of philanthropic effort. But very importantly, it's non-governmental. And if it's non-governmental, that means you didn't elect the people involved. If you believe in elections and voting and these kind of systems as having some kind of effect. Non-governmental organizations means that you have no idea who's in these groups and who's running them, and you have no say over who is running them either. And they could have their own agendas, they can have their own interests. They could be completely counter to yours and your own, and you wouldn't know, and you wouldn't have any way to influence it or do anything about it. So pretty critical and very important to keep our eye on non-governmental organizations, which is probably fair to describe the Rockefeller Foundation as an NGO, I would say, isn't it? They're not elected, but they are striving to wield this enormous amount of power. Peter says in the chat there that it's hubris. Yeah, exactly. It is absolutely hubris. So huge numbers of these NGOs are partnering with the WHO, and then partners include the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. So two notorious foundations here with huge amounts of skeletons in their closets, and just the WHO is openly accepting their money and collaborating with them. So food for thought. According to the Associated Press, And I was surprised that this bit was on the Wikipedia page, but it says the WHO routinely spends about $200 million a year on travel expenses, more than it spends to tackle mental health problems, HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. In 2016, Margaret Chan, Director General of WHO, stayed in a $1,000 per night hotel room while visiting West Africa. So I think that little 2-sentence paragraph there tells you more about what you need to know about this organization than probably the rest of this article does. So I was surprised to see that little nugget on Wikipedia there. All right, so we'll just move on. I've got a few tabs to get through before we get to the reading. So the other tab I pulled up is this epidemiology. And I thought I would look into this because epidemiology, as we just read in the WHO here, is one of the foundational, the foundational thing that the WHO was founded on. It's the operational history says 1947 it established an epidemiological information service. So what is epidemiology? Well, let's have a look. So the word itself, epidemiology, means the study of what is upon the people. It's derived from Greek epi, upon or among, demos, which is people or district, and logos, which is study, word, or discourse. Okay, so the study of what is upon the people. So there's a really interesting history section here about it, including Hippocrates was known as the father of medicine. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he said something like, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food, if I'm not mistaken. And this was quite interesting as well. Back in the 16th century, there was a doctor from Verona who was the first to propose a theory that very small, unseeable particles that caused disease were alive. So this is kind of going back to the origins of the germ theory of disease. And there's a few different theories of disease over the years. There's another one here, which let me see if the miasma theory. This was all about gas. The miasma theory. So. And then you got the germ theory of disease here, and that goes through in the Ming Dynasty. Anyway, I'll fast forward a little bit because I can't do all this history here. It's not the point of this video, but it is interesting and worth getting familiar with. But this bit I highlighted, which tells us that modern epidemiological studies can use advanced statistics and machine learning to create predictive models as well as to define treatment effects. There's increasing recognition that a wide range of modern data sources, many not originating from healthcare or epidemiology, can be used for epidemiological study. Such digital epidemiology can include data from internet searching, mobile phone records, and retail sales of drugs. Apologies, I just realized my little camera was blocking that text there. But the key thing to look at here is data. Machine learning, advanced statistics, machine learning, predictive models. We all know how well the predictive models served us during the Big C event of 2020, don't we? And how well the predictive models predict the weather and other such things. But there's a very important link that I'm trying to establish here and show you between this practice of epidemiology and the gathering and collection of data. Right, so epidemiology, as we'll see, is very much a data-driven practice, and I think this tells us a lot about why it's been sort of hailed and become the central pillar of global public health, the likes of which WHO and Rockefeller and the Bill and Melinda Gates are trying to push. But interesting here that they admit to scouring mobile phone records and your internet searching to feed this into digital epidemiology. So we'll scroll a little bit down, a lot of detail here. And this bit really stood out and tells us a lot about epidemiology, causal inference. So it says, although epidemiology is sometimes viewed as a collection of statistical tools used to elucidate the associations of exposures to health outcomes, a deeper understanding of this science is that of discovering causal relationships. So it tells us, correlation does not imply causation. And that's very important and very true to remember and bear that in mind as we're learning our way forwards. But it's a common theme for much of the epidemiological literature. For epidemiologists, the key is in the term inference. Correlation, or at least association between two variables, is a necessary but not sufficient criterion for the inference that one variable causes the other. Epidemiologists use gathered data and a broad range of biomedical and psychosocial theories in an iterative way to generate or expand theory, to test hypotheses, and to make educated, informed assertions about which relationships are causal and about exactly how they are causal. So it's a lot of waffle. It's a lot of stuff. If you're not used to this kind of language, it could be a bit hard to follow. But I've highlighted the key words here: correlation, association, inference, theories, assertions. Now, is it just me, or does that sound like a lot of basically guesswork? They're not talking about establishing fact. They're not on about testing and proving hypotheses. They're not talking about truth. It's correlation and theories and inference and assertions and association. So I thought that paragraph was pretty important there for giving us a good look into what epidemiology is really all about. The legal interpretation. So this is also very critical. Epidemiological studies can only go to prove that an agent could have caused, but not that it did cause an effect in any particular case. So even in the eyes of the law, it's only establishing a potential kind of maybe possibility that this thing might be the case. So absolutely rock solid, watertight science that you would really like to build your worldwide health system upon, right? So as I was learning a little bit about epidemiology, and I'm thinking about germ theory, I thought, well, let's see what it says in, and the germ theory is like we just read, this idea of tiny invisible living things flying around and making us sick. And the competing idea to that is terrain theory, which is the idea that if you keep the terrain healthy, then the organisms will be fine, and disease will not be a problem, because the terrain will manage the populations and the life cycles of the organisms within it. So I thought, let's type in terrain theory in Wikipedia and see what it says. And this is what came up. And this did give me a good little chuckle. So if you type in terrain theory to Wikipedia, you get germ theory denialism. So are you denying? And the best thing about this is that, like, they tell you here, it's a theory, right? It's not the fully established fact of the germ model of disease denialism. It's theory. You're denying a theory, like, I don't know, but it just, the mind boggles at the way they talk about these things, right? So very telling, very important. And you cannot learn about the terrain theory on Wikipedia because it will take you to this page about denialism. You're a denier. How dare you? How dare you? So I thought that was pretty interesting, and very, very, because you would think they might at least give it. Oh, there is a bit of terrain theory here. Obsolete medical theory. So that's all they've got on it. So, well, you can tell that there's clearly a bias here, I would say. And I haven't actually read through this to see what it says, but you could do that if you feel so inclined. But I just thought it was funny and worth pointing out. So we had a look at Tedros on change.org. Now let's go to the World Health Organization's page itself. And they tell us right here that this is in the About WHO, the funding, our contributors. It tells us about the Rockefeller Foundation, partner in global health, celebrating over 70 years of collaboration. And it goes back, their collaboration goes back to the beginnings of the World Health Organization. So we may learn a little bit in the book as we carry on reading about this relationship. Further down, the foundation has been committed and regular supporter of WHO with contributions totaling more than $25.6 million since the year 2000. That's quite a bit of cash. And then a lot of people wearing face nappies, taking a selfie. And then a quote here from the current president of the Rockefeller Foundation, Raj Shah, says, "Data is what moves us from a panic-driven response to a science-driven one." So again, here's this idea of data. We must collect more data. We need data to keep people healthy. And so you can see this sort of push for technocracy, for the tracking, tracing, and databasing of everything you'd think, say, do, spend, buy, look at, share, like, comment on. All these things are being collected and fed in, and it's because we care about your health, of course. And then this was actually a pop-up just on that last. So down here, there's this genomic surveillance, and I didn't actually read this section about it. I just clicked to enlarge that. But why is genomic surveillance important? Well, disease detectives and health authorities need different types of data to control outbreaks, including clinical and lab data, epidemiological data, all right, okay, if you insist, environmental data, okay, and other contextual data. So this bit stood out to me, and I'm just thinking, so what exactly falls under this category here of other contextual data? But it's interesting to use the word surveillance. It's not monitoring, it's not let's track the health, let's keep an eye on it, it's surveillance. They're basically coming right out and saying it, that they want everybody under surveillance at all time, so that they can keep you healthy. But it's in the same way that people who run factory farms monitor their cattle and livestock in order to keep them healthy enough. And it's not about like maximizing health and wellness. It's about keeping you healthy enough for their purposes, I would say. So in genomic surveillance, that might be a term to keep an eye on and watch out for in future developments. And this is the current president of the Rockefeller Foundation, Rajiv Shah. And wouldn't you know it, what a surprise, he spent time at the London School of Economics, where he earned a general course certificate in economics. So London School of Economics, there it is again. We've talked about it many times on this channel, reading particularly the Bertrand Russell book, Has Man a Future, which is on the playlist there, when we were looking into his teaching career, the kind of places and people and organizations that propped him up and gave him such a wide reach. Beatrice and Sidney Webb, the people who founded the London School of Economics, and we looked into that organization. Very august, very relevant to the unrolling of the agendas today, because the LSE is training the people to occupy the positions of all the established organizations and companies and groups and NGOs, and this is where they get their worldview. This is where they get the green light to be put in these positions, because they will display their allegiance and their loyalty and their trustworthiness at that time. And so LSE, anytime you see that popping up, that should be a red flag, should make your spider sense tingle. So I wasn't surprised whatsoever to find out this guy had been there. And actually, I didn't even read the rest of his entry. There could be all sorts of other little crumbs in there. I just found that one and thought, okay, that's enough for me. So here's a Guardian article from 8 years ago, 2016. Are Gates and Rockefeller using their influence to set the agenda in poor states? I won't spend too long on this because we want to get into the book. I've already been rambling for half an hour. But there's some interesting admissions here, and you can see that this is, it's nice that they keep these articles live, because it shows you the Guardian back when they would question and raise these kind of issues and concerns about Gates and Rockefeller. These days, they're very much bought off, paid for, and totally in line with the agendas being pushed by Gates and Rockefeller. But it's a good article to look at and read, because it shows you how these kind of mainstream outlets, they just sway and they just change and they just hop on whatever the message is at the current moment. And you'll see here, this is 2016, so it was way before the Big C event took off. and was rolled out. And back then they were questioning all this money, the size, the amount of assets that they own, the where they were putting it, and how they were probably, in all likelihood, using it to roll out experiments in poorer countries and poorer nations. So this is kind of from back when The Guardian did a half decent job of what they're supposed to do. Nowadays, I don't think they're doing even a half decent job. So I'll put that in the links underneath as well. Here's another one. This is a $100 million public health initiative launched by the Rockefeller Foundation in 2019. And what is it doing? Well, they want to prevent 6 million deaths. Interesting number, isn't it? 6 million deaths. They're going to prevent 6 million deaths by rolling out data science technologies and innovations. In its initial phase, the foundation and UNICEF will focus on reducing maternal and child mortality by integrating and analyzing data that allows for a decentralized decision-making process and real-time monitoring across primary and community health systems. Data is a powerful tool that can help us make life-saving decisions and prevent epidemics before they happen. So again, you can see this connection here between these charitable philanthropic foundations, epidemiology, and data harvesting, data gathering, and surveillance. And they actually use the word surveillance. And so this is my last tab for my introduction here that I wanted to give to you, and I may even drop this in the chat soon after. So this is an existing crowd justice, which I've never seen this website before, but I suppose it's a kind of crowd funding platform. And there's 4 days to go on this. And this is UK reject and exit the WHO, and this is by the People's Lawyers. So they're trying to raise money, and they're not doing that well. The last American Vagabond was doing much better. So maybe we can help them out. Maybe we can throw a couple of quid their way. It's a very detailed explanation under here. They've got 4 case updates. But these lawyers were back in May 2020 starting legal action against the UK government regarding the unlawful COVID regulations. They took the UK government to court. They fought a long, hard legal battle, and they were finally forced to stop unlawfully using the regulations and the statutory instruments and to seek parliamentary approval instead. So these lawyers, this group here, are kind of, at least partially responsible for having these things, for lessening the amount of tyranny that we had to endure during that time. But now they are trying to organize against this pandemic treaty. So the pandemic treaty is this ridiculous agreement that the WHO has drafted and concocted and is trying to get all these countries to sign on to. And what it will happen is that the WHO, who were responsible for the lockdowns, restrictions, and regulations during the first Big C event, they are now demanding to have overall power over all world governments for all future public health emergencies of international concern. The result will be far worse than anything experienced in any country to date. It will be a dystopian nightmare. So the WHO must be stopped now before they get the chance to carry out their power grab. So if you are alarmed at all by this gentleman, Tedros, who is wanted for crimes against humanity, being at the head of this WHO, and their shady origins being interlinked with the Rockefeller Foundation, and the fact that they are funded by unelected people who you don't know and you have no control or influence over, then this is a way that you can fight back a little bit and throw some money in support of people who are trying to do that fight on behalf of all of us. And interestingly, they put in this little bit here, which said, from our new original research, we have discovered that the WHO was fraudulently set up in the first place in 1945 and 46 by the US government and the Rockefeller Foundation. And this was done by falsely manipulating Chinese and Brazilian UN conference delegates in 1945, and that the UK was unlawfully signed up to the WHO in 1946 without parliamentary or even government knowledge or permission. Incredible stuff if true. How about that? So this is the final link I wanted to put on your radar. Something we can actually do, or where we can actually get involved to try and stick a finger in the eye of these power cowards. Cool. Hope that was informative and useful and helpful, and a nice little preface to tonight's reading. So we left off the book at it was chapter 3, wasn't it? I think we finished chapter 3. No, we did chapter 4 even, and we're on to chapter 5 tonight. So I'll just have a quick look at the old comments, see what's going on in there, and have a sip of water. Oh, you guys are chatty tonight. Lovely. Okay. Heidi says, I feel much better in the know than naively thinking that the world is meant to be so dysfunctional. I appreciate your readings very much. I appreciate you being here, Heidi. At least as much, if not more, than you appreciate my readings. I can tell you that right now. But yeah, that's how I feel. I'd rather know and have an idea about what's going on and why it's happening, and be able to connect dots as things unfold. It's a more, like I said, it can be kind of lonely and isolating, but it's also better than being just naively unaware, blissfully ignorant. You know, people say ignorance is bliss, but I don't think it is really. Heidi says, Worldwide Harm Organization. Yeah. World Harm Organization. It should be that, shouldn't it? Peter says, that's the way it's always done. Just peruse history. And it's always the criminals they put in the positions of power. Yeah. Frank says, in excess of 30,000 NGOs operating in the Republic of Ireland. Whoa, 30,000. Incredible. Heidi says, epidemiology is sorcery, trickery. Adamski says, guessing, basically. Yeah. It sounds like that. I mean, the Wikipedia article makes it sound like that anyway. Heidi says, I'm a terrain theory gardener and fish keeper. It's working splendidly. I'm very glad to hear that. That's excellent. Awesome. All right. So I think we're ready to get into the book now, which is what we're all here for. Let's face it. So let's go over to the book cam and see how that's looking. Hopefully that's bright enough. I'll just do a quick adjustment. Cool. So I won't give a summary or a synopsis of everything we've read so far. If you're new here or you're just diving in for the first time, there's a playlist on the channel. It's got all the previous readings, the first 4 chapters. It's very important stuff. But I'm sure this one will be good as a standalone one. You can go back and check. It's not really a narrative. You know, it's not, you don't really need the first 4 chapters to understand the next ones. But it's a lot of interesting background. And you can see how an incredible amount of funding and money has gone into this medical paradigm that we are then in turn indoctrinated into from being very young. And is it making people healthier? Are people thriving? You know, are the people in your life, are the people down the supermarket who you walk past in the street? Can you just see this kind of vibrant, healthy, energetic, like slim population around you? Or is it something a little bit different? In the case of where I live, it's something a little bit different. But your experience could be, you could be living somewhere wonderful where everyone's really healthy, and in which case, I'm glad to hear it. So this is chapter 5, and this is all about the challenge of yellow fever. On no disease in the long list of human afflictions did the Rockefeller Foundation put greater emphasis or a larger proportion of time and financial support than on yellow fever. For over 30 years, beginning in 1915, this disease absorbed the concentrated attention of a large staff of doctors and scientists working in Latin America and Africa, as well as in the laboratories in New York. The record of their activities is one of the dramatic installments in the developing saga of preventive medicine. It is the story of a long-sustained and far-flung campaign against a baffling enemy who, more than once, masked his defense and struck back from unexpected quarters. So 2 things to comment to my mind there. They keep talking in this book, Raymond Fosdik keeps talking about how the Rockefellers are trying to engage in preventive medicine. Again, look around you, your own life, your own results, our health. Actually, you know, I've just realized this. When I've seen that phrase preventive medicine, I've been kind of reading it as preventing disease and preventing illness. But you could kind of glance over this and see that they're actually preventing medicine. Like they're preventing healing and they're preventing health. That's probably a bit of a stretch. But my point is that are all these chronic conditions, are they going away? Have they succeeded in their goal is the question. And I'm not so sure. And then the other thing I wanted to comment on is that they're using this wartime language again. They're saying it's the enemy, and they're always framing things in terms of a war and a battle. So it's a war on, it's a war on disease. It's a war on heart disease. It's a war on cancer. So very, which that kind of warlike imagery feeds into the germ theory. Whereas the terrain theory would be a much more kind of cooperative view. It would be a kind of an approach that looks for balance and harmony and stasis and cooperation rather than competition and war and fighting and death and this kind of thing. So it's a very, very different paradigm and very different lens through which to look at things. But you can just see where they're coming from with this book. So, according to historical records, yellow fever first made its appearance in North America in 1668, when severe epidemics occurred in New York and Philadelphia. Thereafter, the disease was recorded from New Hampshire to Florida, as far west as Texas, and up the Mississippi River to St. Louis. Between the years 1668 and 1821, there were no less than 20 epidemics in Philadelphia, 15 in New York, 8 in Boston, and 7 in Baltimore. The ravages continued during the 19th century, and as late as 1905, only 5 years before the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission began its work, yellow fever struck at New Orleans and slashed through the southern states, with 5,000 cases of the disease and 1,000 deaths. It is difficult to exaggerate the terror of these epidemics. The mortality rate was so high that burying parties frequently worked day and night disposing of the dead. People either fled to the country or shut themselves up in their homes. Friends avoided meeting in the streets and handshaking fell into disuse. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? I'm not saying that what happened to us 4 years ago was anything like on the scale of yellow fever, but friends avoided meeting in the streets. I walked past quite a few people who stepped out into like at that time they'd rather take on a bus or a car than just walk past me on a pavement. And handshaking fell into disuse. Yeah, remember all this? And elbow bumps and all that? Ugh, horrible stuff. Commerce was paralyzed. Business came to a standstill. In Buffalo, during the Civil... So what this is telling me, this is suggesting to me that this was an actual legitimate epidemic, and they looked at this and they saw what happened, and then in the last illegitimate one, they simulated all of these outcomes and they made it appear. So they made friends avoid meeting each other, and they got rid of handshakes. They paralyzed the commerce. The businesses came to a standstill to make it look as though, to make the illusion, to show this illusion of it happening, when in fact, was it? I don't think it was. Something was happening. People were getting ill, but I don't think it was what we were told by the televisions. In Buffalo, during the Civil War, the rumor that Confederate sympathizers in Canada were sending across the Niagara River bundles of rags infected with yellow fever germs caused a panic in which a substantial proportion of the population evacuated their homes. In some of the southern cities, yellow fever was present almost continuously. In Charleston, South Carolina, deaths from the disease occurred practically every year in the 19th century, and there were frequent and violent epidemics in Galveston, New Orleans, and other Gulf ports. Mexico, Central and South America, and the West Indies were haunted by the disease, and it richly earned the title, which it bore for 3 centuries, the terror of the Western Hemisphere. Not until the United States Army Commission under Major Walter Reed demonstrated in Cuba during the Spanish-American War that yellow fever is transmitted by mosquitoes and not by contact or by contaminated objects was any progress made in the control of the disease. The offending mosquito was identified as the Stegomyia, now known under the scientific name Aedes aegypti, and popularly designated as the Aegypti, or Egypti. I'm not sure how to say that, but interesting that it sounds like Egypt, Egypti. When General W.C. Gorgas, the chief sanitary officer of the United States Army in Cuba, made quick use of Reed's discovery and by vigorous anti-mosquito measures in Havana caused yellow fever to disappear as if by magic, the first battle in the conquest of the disease had been brilliantly won. 3 years later, by applying similar measures in Panama, Gorgas made possible the building of the Panama Canal. When Wycliffe Rose returned from his hookworm trip to Malaya and the Philippines in 1914, he told Gorgas of the serious apprehension in the Far East over the possibility that yellow fever might be introduced into that area as a result of the opening of the Panama Canal, which was then nearly completed. Gorgas showed keen interest and expressed the opinion that yellow fever could be, quote, eradicated from the face of the earth within a reasonable time and at a reasonable cost, end quote, and that the Foundation could not undertake a more rewarding activity. The Foundation thereupon created a Yellow Fever Commission under the chairmanship of General Gorgas, and in 1916 this commission visited suspected endemic centers in Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil. To appreciate the developments over the next decade, it is necessary to understand two assumptions which underlay the approach of the Gorgas Commission to yellow fever. The first was based on Walter Reed's conclusion, which, because it had been proved in Cuba and Panama, was accepted without question: that the sole carrier of the disease was the Aegypti mosquito. This mosquito is distinctly domestic in its habits. It breeds almost exclusively in and around houses and has practically never been found in swamps, rivers, lakes, and other places where malaria mosquitoes usually breed. Consequently, the belief developed that yellow fever was largely an urban disease, depending for its maintenance upon the simple cycle man-mosquito-man, and was spread from one point to another either by the movement of the human host during the period of incubation or by the accidental transportation of the infected mosquito from place to place. The second assumption, the so-called key center theory, which Gorgas and his scientific colleagues strongly held, was that endemic centers of yellow fever are the seed beds without which there can be no epidemics. If the seed beds are destroyed, the disease will disappear from all other points. If these two assumptions had been wholly true, the story of the conquest of the disease would have taken a far different course. Unfortunately, the epidemiology of yellow fever turned out to be infinitely more complex than these simple assumptions indicated, with the result that a decade later, when the disease seemed to be almost under control, if not eradicated, it suddenly struck back with savage fury. Gorgas' commission returned from South America with the conclusion that the only endemic center existing at the time was Guayaquil in Ecuador. The commission's report contained 3 recommendations: to eliminate the infection from Guayaquil, to keep under observation the east coast of Brazil and the southern littoral of the Caribbean, and to undertake intensive work to control yellow fever at any point in the area where it might be discovered. And finally, to extend the investigation to Mexico and West Africa, which regions are under suspicion but have not yet been examined. 2. The years that followed were years of intense activity and what seemed at first to be complete success. Gorgas was made director of the Foundation's work for the eradication of yellow fever, the word eradication being indicative of the high expectations of the moment. And in notifying him of his appointment, the Foundation expressed the hope that it would be his privilege to write the last chapter in the history of the disease. By the use of the same methods which had been employed in Havana and in Panama, Guayaquil, where for generations yellow fever had been rampant, was clear of the disease. A staff of 125 men working in 25 squads rid the city of the Aegypti mosquito. They screened the water storage tanks, cleaned out the roof gutters, and cleared the courtyards and surroundings of the houses of cans, buckets, and other containers where the mosquito could breed. They drained, ditched, and oiled, and resorted to such ingenious devices as using fish to devour mosquito larvae in the water barrels. In 1918, there had been 460 cases of yellow fever in Guayaquil. In May 1919, 6 months after the control work began, the last case of the disease was recorded, and in the years that have followed, there has been no recognized case of yellow fever in all of Ecuador. The key center hypothesis seemed to be justified. Thereafter, proceeding on the same theories and utilizing the same techniques, intensive campaigns were inaugurated in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador, Nicaragua, Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. In every case, the method used was to prevent the breeding of Aegypti mosquitoes in the key center communities. The results in the I just thought this sounds to me like terrain management. They're managing the terrain, aren't they? They're clearing the gutters. They're moving the standing water. They're putting the fish into the water barrels to eat the larvae. So they're going in with a sort of terrain intervention. In other words, the results in the principal coastal cities were as completely successful as they had been in Guayaquil. But contrary to expectations, the disease continued to appear spasmodically in some neighboring communities and even in interior towns. However, good news seemed to be at hand. Dr. Hideo Noguchi, the distinguished scientist from the Rockefeller Institute, who had been a member of the earlier commission to Ecuador, isolated from the blood of 6 out of 27 reported yellow fever patients a spirochete, which produced in guinea pigs lesions suggestive of yellow fever. So this word spirochete, I've never heard that before. I don't know what that is. To this he gave the name Leptospira icteroides, which means slim spiral, the jaundice resembler. And after prolonged study, he came to the conclusion that it was the cause of yellow fever, in spite of the fact that, years before, Reed had traced the cause to a filterable virus. Noguchi prepared a vaccine and immune serum, both of which were effective in animals experimentally infected with Leptospira icteroides, and both were thereafter frequently reported, in publications of the Rockefeller Foundation and elsewhere, as effective in the prevention and cure of yellow fever in man. But Noguchi was mistaken. He had not discovered the germ of yellow fever. Instead, he had isolated the germ of Weil's disease, or infectious jaundice, either erroneously diagnosed as yellow fever or concomitant with yellow fever. If this seems like a harsh comment, it must be remembered that earlier workers were groping in the dark without the knowledge which later laboratory research has given us. There were, and still are, many missing pieces in the picture puzzle. For one thing, it was difficult to find experimental animals susceptible to yellow fever. It was not until the rhesus monkey was imported from India that satisfactory results could be obtained, and it was 3 years later before it was discovered that white mice, infinitely more convenient for laboratory purposes, could be used. In the second place, yellow fever presented great difficulties in the way of accurate diagnosis. It was this situation which led Noguchi astray. Since his tragic death in Africa while working on the problem of yellow fever, laboratory research has provided techniques hitherto unknown. Prominent among them is viscerotomy, or liver examination, by which the disease can now be diagnosed with great accuracy in cases which have proved fatal. Another technique contributed by the Foundation's laboratory is the so-called mouse protection test. By testing the blood of individuals for its power to protect mice against injections of yellow fever virus, it is possible to tell whether those individuals ever had the disease. One of the American soldiers who voluntarily exposed himself to yellow fever in Walter Reed's experiments in Cuba after the Spanish-American War contributed blood which protected mice against the disease 30 years after the soldier's illness. It's now possible, therefore, to chart the geographical distribution of yellow fever and discover where it has been. But these tools were in the future, and the hypotheses with which the campaign had started seemed to be working well. General Gorgas in 1920 had led an expedition to West Africa to determine the relationship of yellow fever in that continent to the disease in the Western Hemisphere. He died en route, but the expedition continued, and 4 months later submitted a report to the effect that, while no authentic cases had been seen, there was strong indication of the presence of the infection in recent years. In 1925, a second commission was sent to West Africa for a prolonged period of study. Yellow fever in the Americas was apparently rapidly diminishing and seemed to be sufficiently under control to permit the release of experimental personnel and adequate funds for the undertaking in Africa. By the end of the year, the commission was well established in Lagos, Nigeria, with a staff of 8 people, a thoroughly equipped laboratory, and 5 buildings brought from New York. Extensive studies were begun not only of the symptoms and pathology of yellow fever in natives and Europeans, but of the habits and distribution of the Egypti mosquito. It was shown that the African disease was identical with the disease in Latin America, thus clearing up the troublesome question whether or not the Old World yellow fever and the New World fever were the same. It was shown, too, that the Egypti mosquito was present in Africa in such numbers that the disease could easily be transmitted as it was transmitted in the Western Hemisphere. It was in Lagos that substantial advances were made in laboratory techniques, including the use of the rhesus monkey as a satisfactory experimental animal. It was here, too, that tragedy struck, and 4 of the scientists on the commission died of the disease, the secrets of which they were attempting to discover. Dr. Howard B. Cross of the Foundation staff had already died of yellow fever in the campaign in Mexico, and the fatal infection of Dr. Paul Lewis in Brazil lay some years ahead. In the African laboratories on the edge of the jungle, the 4 gallant men who gave their lives in what Pasteur called, quote, the peaceful strife of science, were Dr. Noguchi, Dr. Adrian Stokes, Dr. William Alexander Young, and Dr. Theodore B. Hayne. When Dr. Stokes realized he had been stricken through some unsuspected laboratory exposure, he insisted that mosquitoes be fed on him so that the disease could be passed in the natural way from a typical human case to rhesus monkeys, thus proving beyond any doubt that the experimental disease in monkeys was true yellow fever. So this guy contracts the disease that he's studying, and he's like, dying wish is to make sure that he can pass it on to a bunch of helpless, innocent monkeys. What a hero. As this generation looks back on the progress that has been made over the years in increasing our knowledge of yellow fever and arming us with tools to control it, it can truly be said that these men did not die in vain. Meanwhile, in Central and South America, progress in the control of the disease seemed to be completely reassuring. The reports of the Rockefeller Foundation prior to 1929 expressed the belief not only that yellow fever was fast disappearing as a human menace, but that it had been practically eliminated. Indeed, in 1925, only 3 cases of yellow fever were reported from the entire Western Hemisphere. In the 11 months following April 1927, no cases were reported, and it was assumed that the battle, which had cost the lives of research workers and millions of dollars, was practically won. Quote, the disease seems almost banished from the Western world, wrote Dr. Vincent in his President's Review of 1927. Then, almost without warning, yellow fever erupted from its hidden and hitherto unknown home in the jungle of South America and struck for the coastal cities. Rio de Janeiro, which had been free of the disease for 20 years, had an epidemic in 1928 with 144 cases and a mortality rate in excess of 50%. Other epidemics of undetermined numbers were reported from the hinterland, forcing a re-examination of the hypotheses which had been so carefully developed over the years, and a complete overhauling of the epidemiological concepts behind the campaign. Good to know that all these lives of research workers and millions of dollars were well spent then. Part 3. From the perspective of the present, it is easy to see the oversimplification of the earlier underlying assumptions. In the first place, Walter Reed's idea that the Egypti mosquito is the sole carrier of the disease was based on inadequate information. The Egypti is perhaps the principal carrier, but there are other carriers too, and yellow fever can occur, and frequently does occur, in areas where there are no Egypti mosquitoes. In earlier days, this was considered an impossibility. Indeed, in 1916, General Gorgas, in his survey of Mutso, Colombia, where yellow fever had been reported, declared that the disease did not exist and had not recently been present because no Egypti mosquitoes or their larvae could be found. And this in the face of the fact that 5 cases with 2 deaths had been reported as yellow fever within the year, and that locally there was a general belief that the disease existed permanently in the region. This belief has since been adequately substantiated. In the second place, the key center theory that the destruction of a few so-called seed beds would cause yellow fever to disappear became untenable, as the research of the ensuing years proved that the disease had a permanent home in the tropical forests of the vast hinterland of South America and Africa. Existing under these conditions, it is called jungle yellow fever, but it is the same disease as that carried by Egypti mosquitoes in urban communities. The damage to liver is identical, and the virus, when inoculated into mice or monkeys, gives the same results as the urban virus. A person infected in the jungle may, when entering a community where there is a heavy Egypti breeding, serve as a source of infection for the mosquitoes and thus initiate an epidemic of yellow fever of the classical urban type. Although the clinical picture of yellow fever is the same, whether the infection develops in the town or in the jungle, the epidemiology of the 2 types is quite different. Egypti transmitted yellow fever is generally acquired indoors. It tends to involve all non-immunes of all ages living in infected houses. Jungle yellow fever, on the other hand, is usually acquired in or at the edges of the forest during working hours by those whose occupation takes them to the woods. It does not tend, in the absence of Egypti, to involve other members of the household living under the same roof with infective cases. This new knowledge did not come all at once. It took almost 20 years of research to develop it, and the work is still continuing because there are many questions as yet unanswered. During this period, the Rockefeller Foundation had 3 laboratories working on the problem, one in New York, one in West Africa, and one in Bahia, Brazil. Research posts were established in 7 localities, 4 of them in South America and 3 in Africa. The main South American posts were at Rio de Janeiro and Bogota, with substations at Ilheus in Brazil and Villa Vincentino in Colombia. The African work stretched across the continent from Lagos in Nigeria to Entebbe in Uganda, with an additional field station in Bwamba Forest in western Uganda. Field expeditions also constituted an important instrument in the intensified research. As a result of the fresh knowledge which this wide-flung effort has developed, the old cycle of man-mosquito-man in the transmission of the disease has had to be modified. While this is still the pattern under urban conditions, in the jungle the infection spreads without relation to routes of human travel. Indeed, it may be said, without relation to men. It was obvious, therefore, that the disease was transmitted by unknown carriers and through hosts other than man. But that's only obvious if you're assuming that it is this transmission has to happen, by something being carried by another living thing. As the first step, all available forms of insect life in the jungle, whether blood-sucking or otherwise, were collected, divided into broad groups such as mosquitoes, ticks, etc., and then ground, centrifuged, and filtered. What a job. The filtrates were inoculated into white mice and rhesus monkeys. By these methods, the presence of yellow fever virus was demonstrated in several species of mosquitoes. So they're collecting bugs, grinding them down into a paste, injecting that into monkeys and mice, and then when their liver fails, they're saying, "Yep, yellow fever." It's incredible. Notably, I'm not even going to bother trying to read those different species of mosquitoes. I'll skip to the next sentence, which is here. In spite of repeated attempts to isolate the virus from many classes of insects, no virus has been found in any form of insect life other than mosquitoes. The next step was to determine the susceptibility of jungle animals to yellow. Well, that's quite curious, isn't it? That this virus can only live in mosquitoes. and no other insect can carry it. The next step was to determine the susceptibility of jungle animals to yellow fever virus. In Villavicencio alone, located in an endemic yellow fever region, more than 2,000 animals were trapped, ranging all the way from mice to wildcats and from birds to snakes and other reptiles. Each was tested to see whether it had acquired immunity to yellow fever, or, if not, whether it responded to inoculation with the virus. 2 species only showed positive results, the monkey and the opossum. That is, antibodies against yellow fever were found in the bloodstreams of these 2 species, evidence that at some time in the past they had had the disease. At Ilheus, a sick monkey, a marmoset, was trapped, and in its bloodstream was discovered not antibodies, but the active virus of yellow fever. The animal soon died, and exhaustive laboratory tests showed conclusively that it had died of yellow fever. Similarly, at the stations in East Africa, much supporting evidence has been found to substantiate the belief that monkeys, whose population in this area is estimated at 400 per square mile, are the principal hosts of yellow fever. The species of monkey peculiarly susceptible is the redtail, and the mosquito vector is the Aedes africanus, which lives in trees and at night bites the redtail as he sleeps there. The redtail is a notorious raider of banana gardens, where he is bitten by another mosquito, the Aedes simpsoni. Simpson. Contaminated originally by the Africanus mosquito, the monkey in turn contaminates the Simpsoni mosquito, which in its turn relays yellow fever to the human victim. The result of all these investigations seems to justify the generalization that yellow fever is primarily a disease of jungle animals transmitted by jungle mosquitoes. The classical form, involving transmission from man to man by the Egypti mosquito, is more of a secondary cycle depending largely upon conditions of population concentration and of mosquito breeding created by man himself. However, the existence of a vast permanent reservoir of infection in the jungle, which has no relationship to Egypti mosquitoes, paradoxically increases the necessity of anti-Egypti control measures in cities and towns. The new discoveries do not minimize the significant part which this classical mosquito plays in the distribution of the disease among human beings. It is not too much to assert that if in urban areas this insect were brought under control as it has been in Brazil, the world could avoid the threat which in these days of fast transit might so easily develop into a cataclysm in India, and even in the Orient, should the virus of yellow fever break through the barriers of quarantine and medical vigilance. 4. In all this work in yellow fever carried on by the Rockefeller Foundation, the high point was the development of a vaccine. Of course it was. By which people can now be protected against the disease as successfully as they are protected against smallpox or typhoid. Worked out in the New York laboratories of the Foundation by Dr. Wilbur A. Sawyer and his associates, it has become the outstanding weapon in the fight against yellow fever. Sheer necessity was the spur in this development. The deaths and illnesses of the early laboratory workers and the apparent impossibility of applying the ordinary techniques of mosquito control to jungle yellow fever made it imperative to try to find a method of immunization, although the hazard of the attempt was all too clear. It is significant that during the years that this study was underway, Dr. Sawyer himself and 6 of his associates contracted the disease in the laboratory, despite the adoption of every conceivable precaution. So great was the anxiety of Dr. Russell, the director of the International Health Board, that more than once he came close to ordering the discontinuance of the work. The vaccination project progressed in 3 stages. In the first stage, a living virus derived from a strain first transferred from man to monkey and thence to mice was employed with immune human serum. This form of vaccination accomplished its immediate purpose of preventing further cases of the disease among investigators, both in the field and in the laboratory, but it was not practicable for large-scale use in yellow fever control. In the second stage, people were vaccinated with a virus strain cultivated in tissue culture. This strain, however, was not sufficiently reduced in virulence to permit its use without immune serum. The third and final stage involved the development of a modified virus strain of exceedingly low virulence, which could be used without any immune serum whatever. This was the famous virus known scientifically as 17D. And from this single strain, practically all vaccines for yellow fever now employed around the world have been derived, although the French neurotropic strain has been used extensively in French Africa. Starting in 1937, the laboratories of the International Health Division of the Rockefeller Foundation began the production on a large scale of the new vaccine. By the end of the year, 40,000 people in Brazil and Colombia had been successfully vaccinated, including the international flight personnel of the aviation companies. The following year, 1 million more were vaccinated. Post-vaccination tests during this period proved that more than 90% of those vaccinated had developed demonstrable immunity. When the war broke out, the demand for the vaccine was so great that the Foundation had to double both its laboratory space and the number of its technicians. The armed forces of America, Great Britain, and many of their allies were vaccinated for yellow fever, and the soldiers, sailors, and airmen deployed in endemic areas in Africa and Latin America were thus fully protected from the disease. Indeed, it is doubtful whether, without this protection, military contingents could have been detailed to certain sectors which they occupied. Experience in endemic centers of yellow fever over many decades proves that this disease can upset the best planned military operations. From 1942 to 1946, approximately 34 million doses of vaccine were manufactured and distributed without cost to governments, health agencies, and other official units. At the end of this period, the Foundation discontinued its operations in this field. The demonstration had been successfully made, and the responsibility for future manufacture and distribution was passed on to the United States Public Health Service, government agencies in Brazil and Colombia, and other institutes in England, South Africa, and India. The significance of this new weapon against yellow fever can hardly be overestimated. The whole approach to the disease is now built around it, just as the approach to typhoid or diphtheria begins with individual immunization. The fact that it was the culmination of years of planned research directed toward a single goal surrounds the entire achievement with high distinction. 3 footnotes to the vaccination project perhaps deserve attention. The first relates to an outbreak of jaundice early in the war among the armed forces, an outbreak which appeared to be associated with certain definite lots of the yellow fever vaccine. Curious. In the preceding years, a total of nearly 8 million vaccinations had been successfully administered without any disturbing consequences whatever. That's a pretty good record. Army and Navy experts joined the Rockefeller Foundation staff in intensive research of this unanticipated difficulty, and the results showed that the jaundice was due to a virus contained in the human blood component employed in making the vaccine. Oddly enough, at the same time, cases of jaundice were appearing among British and Russian troops following the administration of vaccines or serums which were manufactured in those countries for measles and mumps and which also contained a human blood component. The discovery opened up medical problems which have not yet been fully solved, but a method was evolved by which the yellow fever vaccine could be successfully made without the use of human serum, and the risk of jaundice was definitely eliminated. During the brief period of its existence, this jaundice earned the nickname among the troops of Rockefeller's disease. The second footnote is the curious fact that the scientists in the Foundation laboratory have never been able successfully to repeat the long series of tissue cultures which culminated in the 17D virus strain. Somewhere in the train of subcultures, an unknown mutation occurred, which has thus far defied duplication. A humorist in the Foundation has suggested that perhaps during the course of the protracted research, a steamboat whistled in the East River, thus causing a precipitation in a test tube which cannot now be reproduced. The matter has no practical importance because the 17D virus strain can be indefinitely multiplied, and material for successful vaccination will always be available. It is, however, an interesting sidelight on the baffling intricacies of scientific research. The third footnote is a matter of symbolic interest. It has to do with the fact that the 17D strain of virus goes back to a blood specimen taken in 1927 in West Africa from a black native named Asibi who was sick with yellow fever. This specimen was inoculated into a rhesus monkey which had just been received from India. Asibi recovered, but the monkey died of the disease. Practically all the vaccine manufactured since 1937, both by the Rockefeller Foundation and by governmental and other agencies as well, derives from the original strain of virus obtained from this humble native. Carried down to the present day from one laboratory animal to another, through repeated tissue cultures and by enormous multiplication, it has afforded immunity from yellow fever to millions of people in many countries. Through the creative imagination of science, the blood of one man in West Africa has been made to serve the whole human race. 5. The hope of General Gorgas that he could have the privilege of writing the last chapter in the history of yellow fever was not fulfilled. Problems which he and his associates did not dream of still remain to be solved, and continuing research is necessary to overcome the limitations of existing knowledge. For example, at least 2 aspects of the epidemiology of jungle yellow fever require further clarification. First, a more accurate delineation of the forested areas in both Central and South America and in Africa where yellow fever virus may exist. And second, additional information on the persistence of the virus in forests during the periods when the known mosquito vectors are very scarce. It may also be added that, as with many other virus diseases, there is no effective treatment for yellow fever after symptoms have appeared. The work of the Foundation has been concerned with prevention rather than with cure. But as a result of the undiscouraged activities of the last... because remember, a patient cured is a patient lost. But as a result of the undiscouraged activities of the last 3 decades, yellow fever has been pushed back to a position of secondary importance. It is still a potential menace, capable of violent outbreak, but there are techniques at hand today by which it can far more readily be brought under control. When yellow fever broke out in Panama in 1948, impressive measures were marshalled for its suppression. 250,000 doses of vaccine were flown by airplane from the United States and Brazilian government laboratories, and trained personnel was immediately dispatched from half a dozen countries. Within a short time, 150,000 persons in the danger area were vaccinated, and control measures that had been tested over the years were instituted. As a result, the fire was stamped out before it had time to spread, whereas a generation or more ago, it might easily have been a catastrophic disaster. In this development, the work of the Rockefeller Foundation has been of outstanding significance. It has broadened the area of knowledge in relation to the disease. It has added fundamental techniques of control. Its staff of experts has carried on research in the 2 great endemic areas from Senegal in West Africa to the upper reaches of the Nile, and from the Amazon Valley in South America, north to the Rio Grande and south to the Argentine. Throughout its fellowship system, it has trained men all over the world who now occupy positions of leadership in the campaign. It sounds like they've penetrated the campaigns. It has created permanent yellow fever institutes at strategic points in the endemic regions. If the function of a privately endowed foundation in the field of health is to blaze a trail, to try out techniques, to experiment with fresh methods, to pass back to the permanent authorities of the state the new ideas that are captured, then the Rockefeller Foundation has lived up to its standards in meeting the challenge of yellow fever. Fantastic. How about that? Just go back to the big camera there. Pretty fascinating stuff. Oh, this book is getting more raggedy. I'll just have a quick look at the chat. So, well, for my thoughts on that chapter, I think they're bigging themselves up. It sounds like they didn't actually get rid of the disease. I think their initial focus on getting rid of the standing water and trying to prevent the mosquitoes from breeding was probably a better approach. Maybe mosquito nets would have been a good shout as well. But it sounds to me like it wasn't absolutely cut and dry, proven what was causing the disease and how it spread. Again, this is epidemiology, so they're kind of dealing in theories and assertions and guesses and correlations. So I think he was really over-egging their success there. I don't think their success was quite as good as they made it out to be. But interesting that they came up with the vaccines and rolled that out, and quite an incredible story about grinding up bugs and insects and injecting them into mice and rats, and then saying, "See, it's yellow fever." It sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Same kind of playbook that I think we've seen rolled out in the last 4 years. But let's have a quick look at the chats. Okay, so Gwen Weston says, Aedes aegypti literally means the hateful from Egypt, the hateful mosquito from Egypt. Wow. Interesting. Did you know that already, or did you just look that up? I mean, I'm impressed if you knew that, Gwen. Heidi says, spirochete is a spiral-shaped bacteria. All right, I didn't know that. Peter's saying, every 3, 5, or 8 years, check the history books. I'm not sure what that's in reference to. Maybe outbreaks of some kind or endemics or something. I'm not sure. Yeah, coincidences. A lot of coincidences coming up, Peter. There are, aren't there? And then Heidi says Rockefeller's disease. Yeah, I hadn't heard about Rockefeller's disease before, but that alone is very revealing that that phrase was even coined and passed around, and they were using it to say. And then Peter's saying, fortunately for us, they found patient 0 pangolin. Yeah, the pangolin that was eating the bat soup over in China, right? Oh, Gwen, you checked it. Okay, nice one. Well, thank you for that. That was fantastic. One sec. I just got to... That's perfect. Turning this into a kind of collaborative, study group back and forth. That is what it's all about. So thanks for checking that out. So they called it the hateful mosquito from Egypt. Poor mosquitoes, eh? Nobody loves them. Everybody hates them. They got a bad rap. Okay, what time is it? So 10 to 9 p.m. here in England, and I think we could probably get another chapter done. But before I commit to that, I'll just see how long it is. All right. Well, we've got about 12. What would that be? Less than 10 pages. Yeah, we could definitely do another chapter. It's not even 10 pages. Pretty spicy title, though. Well, this doesn't get me banned. Fosdik. He's really not like politically correct. He didn't care about the political correctness at all, did he? He's saying all the banned words, controversial search terms. But times were very different back in the 1950s, weren't they? So this is chapter 6, Invasion from Africa. If Orson Welles, in his famous broadcast, had announced not that the Martians had landed in New Jersey, but that a certain mosquito from Africa had arrived on the American continent, there would have been no public alarm. Indeed, it is doubtful if there would have been any public interest. But the mosquito Anopheles gambiae is potentially a much more dangerous invader than the Martians would have been. H.G. Wells' Martians, it will be remembered, were unable to adjust themselves to life on this planet and quickly died. But when this mosquito invaded Brazil from equatorial Africa in 1930, it proceeded to make itself very much at home. So, very curious that H.G. Wells gets a mention. We did a read through of H.G. Wells' book, The Open Conspiracy. It was the first book we read through, actually. And that's in the playlist if you want to go back and check that out. So, very curious to me that I'd never thought about his War of the Worlds story being a vehicle to spread, pardon the pun, the germ theory or the germ model of or the germ theory paradigm of health and wellness, right? So it would be very interesting to investigate the timeline on that. When did he write that book? When did it come out? And curious that it gets a mention here. It kind of suggests that there's a link between the worldview and the kind of germ theory paradigm being pushed by both H.G. Wells, master propagandist, and also the Rockefellers. Who was this new invader of the Western Hemisphere, and how did it get there? Anopheles mosquitoes are malaria carriers. The Anopheles gambiae is the most dangerous member of a dangerous family. Although the species has hitherto been reported from Algeria and Morocco, and from southern Arabia as well, its principal home is the African tropical belt, extending from the southern border of the Sahara Desert south to the Zambezi River. It is the scourge of Central Africa. Is it scourge or scourge? I'm not sure. I'm going to go with scourge. Of Central Africa, a carrier of a serious and often fatal type of malaria, sometimes complicated by the so-called black water fever. A mosquito cannot fly across the Atlantic Ocean, and until 1930, this insect had never been seen in the Western Hemisphere. In that year, however, or shortly before, it crossed the ocean. It did not invade like an army. A single fertilized female may have been the cause of all the misery that followed. This tiny enemy alien was able to enter America because of modern methods of rapid intercontinental travel. An aeroplane, perhaps, which a few hours before had left West Africa, landed on the coast of Brazil, and when its door was opened, the unwanted immigrant flew forth undetected to begin the colonization of a new continent. Far more likely, the stowaway took passage on one of the fast destroyers, which at that time were working in connection with the airlines between Dakar in West Africa and Natal in Brazil, and drifted to shore from the deck of the anchored vessel. It was Dr. Raymond C. Shannon, an entomologist on the staff of the Rockefeller Foundation's Yellow Fever Service, who in 1930 first discovered the insect. On a Sunday morning in Natal, with idle time in his hands, he took a busman's holiday and went out to catch mosquitoes. Dipping his net in a shallow pool near the railway station, he dredged up a number of them, which in routine fashion he placed in a bottle for later examination. Although he had never personally seen a Gambier mosquito, his examination convinced him that one of the mosquitoes in the morning's catch belonged unmistakably to that species. And knowing the danger that was involved, he reported his finding to the New York office by cablegram. The cablegram caused consternation, but it was hoped that the invasion might be localized by natural conditions unfriendly to the invader. These hopes were disappointed. In 1930 and in 1931, an outbreak of malaria, the severity of which was unprecedented in the annals of the city, occurred in the vicinity of Natal. By 1931, Gambier mosquitoes, following prevailing winds, had travelled up the coast 115 miles. The great drought of 1932 and 1933 seemed to check the invasion, and several years passed without further startling evidence of its presence. Then, with the return of normal rainfall, the onward flight started again. It crept slowly up the coastal plain at an average speed of about 40 miles a year, and it is likely that the insect was often carried by boats from point to point along the shore. The interior of the state of Rio Grande do Norte in this section. Rio Grande do Norte in this section is extremely arid at all times, and the mosquito failed to penetrate it. While the flat alluvial shelf along which it succeeded in breeding its way is in several places so narrow that 15 or 20 men could have stopped the progress of Gambier at any time during these early years, had the geographical direction and goal of the insect been understood. The goal of the insect. Like it's plotting and doing this deliberately. The Gambier did not spread southward from Natal during these first years was a piece of good fortune not easy to explain. It is true that the prevailing winds are in the opposite direction, but the mosquito might have made progress against the wind in cars, boats, and trains. By 1937, the invader had reached the well-populated valleys to the northwest, and calamitous epidemics followed in 1938 in localities 200 miles from Natal. In the Jaguaribe Valley alone, over 50,000 cases of malaria developed during the year. 90% of the population was affected, with mortality in certain districts estimated at 10%. So disabling and widespread was the epidemic that in some places crops were not planted and salt production was greatly reduced because of lack of labour. It was estimated that as a result of the ravages of this mosquito, nearly every person in these affected areas would be on government relief in 1939. Consternation spread not only in Brazil, but in Latin and North America. Public health men knew all too well the hazard involved in the possibility of Gambier continuing its invasion and striking into new territory in an irresistible march. Dr. M. A. Barber, the distinguished American malariologist, expressed the alarm in these words, quote, "This invasion threatens the Americas with a catastrophe in comparison with which ordinary pestilence, conflagration, and even war are but small and temporary calamities. Gambier literally enters into the very veins of a country and may remain to plague it for centuries. Even the penetration of yellow fever into the Orient might be a lesser evil." End quote. 2. Dr. Vincent, the former president of the foundation, in one of his early reports, made this interesting observation, quote, "It has been said that a good malaria fighter must learn to think like a mosquito. He must ask, which of many kinds of anopheline mosquitoes shall I try to imagine myself to be? How far is it possible to fly? When and where is food to be had? Which blood is to be preferred, human or animal? How can one get into a screened house? Where shall one rest after a good meal? Where is the best place to deposit eggs? Is the water of the right kind and temperature? Is it stagnant or flowing? Is there vegetable growth to protect eggs and larvae from fish?" Fortunately, through the work of malariologists in Africa, much was known about the Gambier. It breeds prolifically and rapidly, requiring only 7 or 8 days to develop from egg to adult, a fact that makes breeding possible in very temporary water collections. It has variable breeding habits, but seems to prefer stagnant, sunlit water. It has a high infection rate. During the outbreak in the city of Natal in 1930, almost 2/3 of the 172 specimens of Gambier caught and dissected were found to be infected with malaria, a rate higher than anything hitherto known in the Americas. This mosquito seems to prefer human to animal blood of over 1,000 specimens tested in 1931. 82% contained human blood. It is a domesticated insect. It usually bites indoors, not outdoors. Fairly reliable flight records show that it can cover a distance of 4.5 miles. I would love to know how they got the flight records of mosquitoes. But they're only fairly reliable. Late in 1938, representatives of the Brazilian Health Service and the Rockefeller Foundation staff investigated the infected area in North Brazil. They visited São Gonçalo and Beixa Verde, both of which had heavy outbreaks of malaria following the introduction of Gambier to the region. They also went up the Jaguaribe River to Lavras. This visit confirmed the seriousness of the situation. Once the Gambier gets into a river valley, it spreads up the valley unless blocked at some point by natural or artificial barriers. With the assistance of the Rockefeller Foundation, an anti-Gambier service was organized. Since the necessary expenditures were far beyond the resources of the areas invaded, the national government of Brazil, together with the foundation, assumed the financial responsibility. The malaria service of the northeast of Brazil was created by government decree and began the task of organizing a field force. Dr. Fred L. Soper, representative of the foundation in Brazil, was placed in charge of the direction and administration of the offensive. Dr. D. B. Wilson, also of the Rockefeller Foundation, was his chief associate, and a staff of over 2,000 doctors, technicians, scouts, inspectors, guards, and labourers recruited from Brazil was enlisted in the campaign. This affiliation between government and a private agency made available the wide experience of a well-trained group of men accustomed to working under discipline. Except for the distribution of quinine and atibrin by field personnel working in infested districts, the malaria service did not assume responsibility for medical care of the sick in dispensaries or otherwise. The purpose of the service was to confine the Gambier to the relatively arid areas it occupied, and if possible to exterminate it there. It was realized that, if the mosquito broke through to the well-watered Parnaba, I don't know about that one. These place names are killing me tonight. And São Francisco River valleys, further efforts to prevent its spread to a large part of South Central and perhaps even North America might be unavailing. The Parnahiba, there we go. The Parnahiba Valley is 500 miles from Natal. The Gambier mosquitoes were already nearly halfway there. The organization of the counterattack necessarily involved a period of delay, but the interval was utilized by the Foundation's representatives in scouting the terrain of the approaching battle. The mosquito was still rapidly on the march and had now spread over 300 miles to the west and had infested an area of 12,000 square miles. The first results in the 1939 campaign were frankly disappointing. The organization of the malaria service of the Northeast coincided with the beginning of the rainy season, during which the Gambier naturally makes its maximum progress, and apparent results were not forthcoming. Widespread epidemics of malaria kept occurring, and in the early months of the service, some 114,000 persons were treated for the disease. During this discouraging period, the only tangible consequence of the broad effort was a lowering of mortality from malaria through medication of acute cases. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a sip. The rainy season that year was unusually prolonged, but by July, appreciable results began to appear. The further spread of Gambier in the frontier districts seemed to be minimized, and the incidence of the mosquito was reduced in certain heavily infested sections to a point where careful surveys repeatedly failed to reveal the presence of either larvae or adults. The campaign was revealing that both climate and physical geography were indispensable allies. So the terrain, in other words. Gambier is a mosquito which breeds mainly in residual rainwater pools, shallow, open to the sun and without vegetation. Generally speaking, it does not lay its eggs in permanent or deep water, in running, salty or shaded water, or in water supporting aquatic vegetation. On the other hand, it takes advantage of every little depression in the ground, such as wheel tracks or hoof prints, no matter how shallow or small, which can present a water surface for 8 or 9 days. During the 4 months rainy season, from February to May, with its almost daily showers, Gambier becomes a formidable antagonist. But for 8 months of the year, the heat of the tropical sun, the strong continuous trade winds and the low humidity combine to dry up all shallow surface waters and to make life precarious and of short duration for the Gambier. Potential breeding places are reduced to disconnected pools in the beds of the large rivers, none of which maintains a flow in summer. Most of the higher rolling country inland is practically non-infectable by Gambier. Its arid, stony soil supports a scrub vegetation composed of a resistant thorny bush mingled with cactus. The region is without water for larvae and without shelter for Gambier adults. Part 3. The strategy of the campaign was like the strategy of the Battle of the Bulge. The enemy had first to be contained within the area he had seized, and then surrounded and annihilated. The process of containment involved the establishment of an outside line, defined by fumigation posts on all the outgoing roads. Every vehicle and train leaving the infested area had to be stopped, inspected, and fumigated. A maritime service was organised at points along the coast to disinfect every boat or airplane bound for clean ports. In addition, a 10-mile zone beyond the Gambiai's farthest limit of advance was kept non-infectable, which, from the mosquitoes' point of view, represented the scorched earth policy. Within this zone, as well as within the area already infested, all breeding places of the mosquito were treated with Paris green. The most critical parts of the region were mapped from the air so that no pools, ponds, or other collections of water would be overlooked. The adult mosquitoes were sought and killed in houses with insecticide sprays to diminish the chances of their laying eggs and thus perpetuating the species in the region. It was a war in a very real and grim sense. Unlike other types of war, its purpose was the preservation of human life. By December 1939, the invader had been pushed back to its central stronghold in the main river valleys and on the narrow coastal shelf. If it could be held within those limits during the wet season of 1940, those in charge of the campaign began to hope that it might eventually be eradicated from the entire region. This, of course, would mean extermination of the last surviving pair, and as in all campaigns, accidents might determine the issue. Thus, in one case, the mosquito was transported many miles into previously uninfected territory in an old car which followed an improvised wagon road through the jungle and thus avoided the fumigation post on the main thoroughfare. How do they even know? It's like a Pixar film or something, you know, this one mosquito flying around, like hiding in cars trying to avoid being gassed. In another case, the defense line was broken when in an unguarded moment a small fishing boat carried the mosquito up the coast. If the war was to be won, it was realized that victory could come only through continued vigilance. The wet season of 1940 would be the test. That the test was successfully met with dramatic results beyond expectation was due to the esprit de corps and effective striking power of Dr. Sopper's army. During the critical wet season, the mosquito was pushed back on all sides so that by the beginning of the dry season it had been practically restricted to the lower Jaguaribe Valley. This made possible the concentration in this area of a large number of workers for the final onslaught beginning in July. By the end of the year, it was possible to report that no larvae or adults had been found in the lower Jaguaribe. If anyone's got any suggestions on how to pronounce this word, just type it in the chat, please. Jaguaribe Valley since the first week in September. A small additional focus lying some 35 or 40 miles beyond the known infested area was discovered in October, but it yielded to attack and was apparently clean by the middle of November. During the last 47 days of 1940, no evidence of Gambiai was found in all Brazil, even in areas of earlier infestation. Where control measures had been progressively discontinued, there was no sign of the mosquito. In the Ecofield laboratory alone, microscopic examination of some 2 million anopheline larvae collected during the last 8 months of 1940 from areas where control measures had been suspended failed to reveal any evidence of surviving Gambiai infestation. The critical phase of the campaign was over. Certain mopping up operations might be necessary, but the battle had been won. The invader had brought death and suffering to thousands of people. It had laid waste an entire section of a nation. Its defeat had involved immense effort and the expenditure of over $2 million. But the Western Hemisphere was free, at least for the moment. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, whether the threat is mosquitoes or the evil intentions of men. Aeroplanes are crossing the South Atlantic with increasing frequency. 3 years after the original incursion of the Gambiai had been stamped out in Brazil, mosquitoes of this species were found on a plane coming from Accra and Dakar in Africa to Natal. Even more disturbing was the news that 5 live Gambiai had been discovered in dwellings near the Natal airport. Incoming planes from Africa are, of course, fumigated before they leave Africa and before they land in Brazil, but a few mosquitoes were evidently able to stow away safely in the modern, complicated airplanes. Imagine a mosquito stowing away on an airplane. It just reminds me of like Finding Nemo or something. Thanks to the efforts of the Brazilian authorities, the immediate situation is now in hand, but it poses a problem of larger significance which cannot be evaded. Around the ports of Africa and deep within the hinterland lie the breeding centres of the Gambiae. The safety of the Western Hemisphere, which is now within a few hours' flight across a narrow ocean, can no longer be left to the uncertainties of a spray gun campaign. Modern aeroplane travel has made old methods and ideas of quarantine completely obsolete. If the Americas are adequately and permanently to be protected, the breeding of Gambiae, wherever in Africa or elsewhere it may occur, must be eradicated. The campaign must be carried to the sources of infestation. It can no longer be defensive. It must be offensive. 4. This story has a sequel. In 1942, the Gambiae started on another invasion from its home in Africa, this time in a different direction. It struck north through the Nile Valley in Upper Egypt, pushing its attack to within 200 miles of Cairo, and causing in this and in the following year the most serious epidemic of malaria recorded in Egyptian history. In 1944, a committee of investigation appointed by King Farouk reported that 135,000 people in the infested area had died of this Gambiae-transmitted disease. The military battle of North Africa was still at its height, and the matter had to be handled with the utmost secrecy. A few months later, the Egyptian government requested the assistance of the Rockefeller Foundation, and a plan of campaign was developed under which the government financed the entire cost of the project, while the foundation assumed the responsibility for its direction. The Ministry of Health already had at its disposal, in its mosquito-controlled organization, an army of more than 4,000 men, and this group was made available to Dr. Soper and his associates on the foundation staff, who had been in charge of the campaign in Brazil. The Egyptian government also provided insecticides, headquarters, field stations, and extra funds for emergency needs. The plan of campaign followed the Brazilian experience and involved the extermination of the Gambiae in the infested area. There is no such thing as partial success in species eradication. Estimates of progress based on the traditional methods of the malariologist, such as spleen rates, blood parasite rates, clinical attack rates, infant infection rates, become invalid and subordinated to the simple question: is the species under attack still present in the area being worked? This was the test in both the Brazilian and the Egyptian campaigns, and it was pushed to its logical conclusion, i.e., the extermination of the last surviving pair of the disease-carrying mosquitoes. In Egypt, as in Brazil, Paris green was the principal insecticide, and it was applied in the marshy regions, waterholes, and other potential breeding places, following the technique used in Brazil. Pyrethrum was also used, and 1/2 ton of DDT was employed in the spray painting of railway rolling stock, motor cars, and riverboats that might serve to harbour and transport the insects from one region to another. An elaborate control and inspection system was developed to confine the Gambiae within the area occupied and then to exterminate it in house-to-house warfare. By February 1945, the Gambiae had completely disappeared from the infested area. Careful search failed to discover any of this species, even during the autumn floods, when pools and other breeding places multiply and the worst epidemics are apt to occur. The danger was over, and for the moment at least, this public health battle had been won. Thus, in 2 countries, a demonstration was made of what modern public health practices can accomplish, not only in repelling the carriers of disease, but in creating a rallying point of unity in an international atmosphere too often clouded by suspicion and distrust. Public health work has become one of the techniques of international cohesion. Global government. It provides a new language by which Brazil can speak to Egypt, and the knowledge and experience of one nation can be available to all. And that is the end. Chapter 6. And the next chapter, which I'm not going to read right now, But the next chapter, just as a preview, is called The Johns Hopkins of China. Haha. So that is going to be good. I'm looking forward to continuing with that. 1 second. Yeah. Let's go back to the big cam. So another good chapter. Again, I think we'll go back to Peter's word, hubris, because trying to control insects and bugs and where they go and how they travel and how they move around in the world, it just seems so far-fetched and unlikely and hard to believe it's possible. You know, they're tiny, almost invisible insects. They're the idea that you can track down every single last one of them and wipe them out just seems like a pipe dream to me. But I guess that's part of the claim, isn't it? It's part of the power of scientism. And I think that's one word that I haven't used yet in this series of videos on the Rockefeller Foundation, is just how much these boys were building this kind of scientism religion that so many of us were indoctrinated into at school, the worship of science and data and men in white coats and laboratories and experiments and injections and conical flasks and all this kind of stuff. It's a whole religion, really, because most people just believe in it. They just believe that the scientists know what they're doing and they're following some sort of process and that it's objective and it's rigorous and it's peer reviewed. But the average Joe and Jane in the street is just a believer in science and scientism, and they just trust and have faith in it. But they don't realize it's a religion. They think they're being all smart because they're not believing in God or believing in any whatever the religion flavor of religion happens to be. They think they're all, I'm better than that, I'm bigger than that, and yet they're just pouring all this trust and faith and belief into, you know, an organization of men in white lab coats who are injecting monkeys with insect paste. So I thought that was an interesting chapter. Quite a short, snappy one. Not as revealing to me as the previous one about yellow fever, but still gives us an insight into the way the people in this foundation think and the way they're trying to set up this one world health system of standards and standardization. So let's have a quick look in the chat before we wrap this up for tonight. Let's see. Peter says I might be demonetized. Yeah, I mean, to be like, honestly, I've had 2 emails from YouTube inviting me to become a YouTube partner and monetize the channel, and I'm not interested in it. I don't really want YouTube's money. I'd rather receive the voluntary donations. You don't have to have your minds raped by advertisements, and it's just a better deal for me, I think, for all of us, for everybody involved. So they have invited me to sign up to that program, but I think I'll try and fly under the radar, gradually build up an audience here and kind of expand out that way without having to rely on, you know, ticking the boxes to get the ads on the videos. They're super annoying anyway, aren't they? Heidi says, I think he's referring to the hysteria when War of the Worlds was broadcast. Yeah, and understood as happening by Orson Welles. That's right. Yeah, so that's a real psyop, isn't it? To broadcast this across this was kind of an experiment in mass communication, I think. Similar to what we saw in the last 4 years as well. It was like, okay, if we just bombard everyone at the same time with this message, let's just do it and see what happens. So I think it was a psyop, an experiment to see how people would react and respond. But what I thought was curious, and I think you're right, Heidi, that's why it was mentioned in the book. But that parallel to my mind between the germ theory model and how that it was promoted by the War of the Worlds story, because in the story, the Martians who they were either here already or they invaded, but for whatever reason, the Martians turned up and invaded, and then they all died because they didn't have any immunity against germs, that was the outcome. It was just a total fluke that the germs killed them. And it was interesting because I'd never considered that as pushing the germ theory paradigm before. Peter saying that word is Latin to mean river of the north. Is that the word that I couldn't pronounce? Heidi says, do they still spray insecticide in airplanes now? Not all flights, but some flights that I go on, they do. And you can see that kind of mist coming in from the top. And I always look at it and think, I wonder what that is and if it's how it affects me and what it does to me. And I don't feel very comfortable being sprayed in that way when I'm, there's no way for me to go, nothing I can do or say about it. And I didn't sign anything to say I agreed to be sprayed with whatever is in that spray, but I do see it on planes still. Peter says, say that again about when it comes to species eradication. I think you wrote irradiation, but I think you mean eradication. Well, you want me to go back to that bit? You can watch it on the replay and rewind to that bit because I'm not sure I'll be able to find it quickly right now. But yeah, interesting. Like they're interested in this kind of population control and management. So that's another sort of thing that we see in this day and age that they were trying to do back then, right? Heidi says, they spray my woods with hormones. I have asked for my property to be in the no spray list, but it's really a charade. The breeze carries it right to my place. Yeah, and that reminds me of like the Monsanto scam where they force farmers to use their seeds, and then if the seeds get blown into another farmer's land, then they sue that farmer for using their seeds without permission, if that makes sense. So they have their crops that they have copyrighted and their customers pay for, but if that crop is just through natural processes finds itself growing in the field of a farmer who hasn't paid the company, then the company sues that farmer. I hope I explained that properly. So yeah, it's a real farce and a scam and a charade. You're absolutely right. It's a good, that word is bang on, charade, like so many things these days. Peter says, pretty revealing. They are just playbooks. Yep. Heidi says, spraying hormones for the gypsy moth. That sounds like a good album. Oh, right. So they're spraying, I was going to say, that sounds like the name of an album. They're spraying hormones for the gypsy moth to get rid of it, to control it. Interesting that they would do that with hormones and not some sort of pesticide or insecticide. Peter says, even the response from the radio show was bullsh. They made that up as well. Yeah. Awesome. All right. We're on 2 hours, so I think I'm going to wrap it up there, ladies and gentlemen. Awesome. Another fascinating chapter. We are making good progress in this one now. We've still got quite a lot to go, though, so we might have to pick up the pace a little bit, and I'll try and do shorter preamble rambles and maybe just get straight into the reading. But I thought today was very much worth mentioning, and I said I would drop that link in the chat, and I haven't done it, so I'm going to do that right now. So if you're interested in this, the fundraiser that I mentioned, the Lawyers of Light, is this the Lawyers of Light? There's a few different, the People's Lawyers. Yeah, the People's Lawyers, they put out really good resources. I have one in my wallet, and it's like a card that you can, I'll show you. Do you know what? I'll put it on the book cam. Why not? And we'll use the zoom. It's always good. So I got this from them as well. And this was the idea was if I was accosted by police or any, other goon during the L downs, then I could give them this. And it's a legal notice. It says, asking a man or woman to lay claim to a legal person's name is legal entrapment, unlawful and a crime. By accepting delivery of this legal notice, you agree to our fee schedule notice set out over leaf. Fee schedule notice on the other side is unlawful kidnapping, the sum of £20,000. Unlawful detention, the sum of £3,000 per hour. Unlawful confiscation of personal property or conveyance is £1,000 per day. Taking fingerprints unlawfully against our will is £10,000. Distress and mental anguish is £10,000. Right? So it was a way to do, to handle, these busybodies who were going around enforcing a bunch of fraudulent and unlawful and immoral, not to mention immoral, restrictions on our freedoms and our health and our well-being. and I got that from them. So they put out a lot of good material, and they put out a lot of good resources for people. So I would recommend people look into that kind of thing, because, for example, I didn't learn until lockdowns were occurring that you're not under any obligation to answer the police. If you're not committing a crime and the police ask you a question, you're not under any obligation to answer it. You can just walk away and ignore them. But you'll notice that we've been conditioned to answer it by TV and film and movies, Hollywood. The characters always respond and answer to the police in those shows. But actually, you don't have to. As long you have to flip it and become the one asking the questions. So, am I obligated to answer this question, officer? Am I being detained? What crime am I being detained for? And if the answer is no, then you just say, have a nice day, and you walk away. So these kind of knowing what your rights are and how to interact with law policy enforcers can be useful if you're going to demonstrations and these kind of events. And the People's Lawyers, I think, is a good place to get some info. And I don't know if they have a website or something. But they've done 4 updates here, so it's probably worth looking into. There's another one. There's another group called Lawyers. It's like Lawyers for Light or something in the UK, which I think you can find on Telegram. Cool. We've got a few more chats. Comments just came in. Oh, Heidi's going to share it in the Telegram. Thank you for that. Adamski says, where can you get that card? That's a good question. I can't. It was like first year of L Downs when I got this one. But you could just make it yourself even, You saw me. I put it up on the camera, so you could go back and just find that frame and pause it, type it, print it, laminate it, and carry it around with you. And it's just a way to kind of let people know that you're going to stand in your sovereignty and claim your rights and not be bullied and coerced into stupid nonsense. All right. But I'm no legal advice or any expert or anything, and I've never had to use that. I just like having it there in case somebody is trying to entrap me in some way, and I want to get myself out of that situation. So I don't even know if it will work, but anyhow, yeah. So I think that's it. Let's wrap it up there, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a lovely weekend. I'm not sure when I'm going to be back on, but just keep an eye out. Telegram chat, Instagram. I put a link to my Odyssey channel as well, but there's not as many videos on there, but it's just good to have it there. And, you can sub there just in case this channel ever gets nuked. Hopefully we will be good and we can continue to fly under the radar. So let's leave it there. Take care of yourselves and each other. Enjoy the rest of your Friday, like I said. Until the next one, God bless.